Welcome to the IEA's 22nd webinar of 2025. We'll just get started and we'll have more people join us as we go along. My name is Jacqueline Kagume, and on behalf of the IEA, we would like to welcome you to our discussion this morning, where we'll be discussing entrenching the CDF, the Senate Oversight Fund, and the National Government Affirmative Action Fund, NGAAF, into the Constitution. Our meeting here today is convened by the IEA's Constitution, Law and Economy program, where I work together with my colleague Leo, and we'll be making this presentation together. So before we get into the substantive presentation, brief background about the IEA for those of you who have maybe not interacted with us before. So the IEA is a public policy think tank, and our goal is to inform decision-making in Kenya through policy innovation, research, dialogue, and convening dialogues. Part of our objectives are cutting across the different streams of work that we do is to advance informed public discourse on topical issues of public affairs, and basically also to promote democratic constitutional order and to promote accountable and effective government. A bit of our work is the bulk of our work is mostly economic policy research and analysis, and we work across 6 program areas, from public finance management to understanding the law and the economy to economic competition and regulation policy, thinking about futures and foresight, international trade and development, and lastly, we have popular economics. So our work is structured into those policy areas. And as I had mentioned earlier, the discussion that we're having this morning is convened by the Constitution, Law and Economy program. The presentation today is structured in 2 bits. So I'll make the first part of the presentation, which is basically the legal analysis bit, and then my colleague Leo will come in later to discuss the economic analysis bit. So Leo, we can move to the first slide. So this is the outline of our presentation today, as I mentioned. So I'll start with providing a background to the discussion that we're having, and then make the presentation on our legal analysis of this constitutional amendment bill of 2025, and then we'll have Leo discussing the economic analysis and key messages and conclusions. So next. So in terms of the brief background today, as I mentioned, we are trying to unpack the Constitution of Kenya Amendment Bill of 2025, which was first, or it's a bill dated the 25th of February 2025. Its obvious origin was the National Assembly, where we had Otiende Amolo and Chepkonga noted as the authors of the bill. And the bill has gone through the National Assembly processes and actually been passed by the National Assembly. And the main objective of the bill is basically it's trying to entrench 3 funds into the Constitution. I'll come to the details about those amendments, but basically that's the bill that we are discussing today, the Constitution of Kenya Amendment Bill of 2025. I think most of you here are cognizant of previous attempts at amending Kenya's constitution. There have been several attempts at amending the current constitution that we have. That's the Constitution of Kenya 2010. And a colleague of mine and I tried to dig through the amendments and find out how many of there have been. There have been multiple attempts, at least 21, but the most prominent from our categorization, we found just about 4 or 5. I think you all remember the Okoa Kenya initiative to amend the bill. We had the constitution, we had the Punguza Mizigo initiative, building bridges, one that was obviously has been the most prominent to date, that went through almost the entire process, but was turned back by the courts or and deemed unconstitutional, several provisions of it. And then we now have the current initiative, which is basically an attempt at trying to entrench the three funds that we'll be talking about. The reason why they have all the attempts to amend Kenya's current constitution have failed is because of mechanisms that are entrenched within the constitution itself that have prevented the success of the previous attempts. If you think about the old constitution that Kenya had, the 1963 constitution, the life of that constitution, it went through so many amendments that by the end of it, by 2010, I think most people would categorize it as a mutilated constitution, because then the procedure of amending that constitution and the threshold was not similar to what we have because of the challenges and the experience of that first constitution. The drafters of our current constitution made sure to include specific provisions that would increase or make the threshold to be so high that to be able to effect an amendment, it would actually reflect the sovereign will of the people. So for that reason, if you look at our constitution from Article 255, you will see the procedures and requirements for amending the constitution. And we have two mechanisms. We have amendments by parliamentary initiative, which is detailed in Article 256, amendments by popular initiative in Article 257, and Article 255 itself provides the overarching framework for amending the constitution for both of these processes, but then entrenches specific provisions for which to be able to amend that constitution, then even if the bill, an amendment bill had been approved by Parliament, it would have to go through a referendum. So that, in addition to all the checks and balances in this constitution, have prevented its mutilation. And that's why so far we have not had successful attempts at mutilating our current constitution. So in terms of, so that's the brief background to where we are. And so we go to the next, which is basically now the substantive analysis of the Constitution of Kenya Amendment Bill 2025. So the legal analysis bit of it. So as I've mentioned, the bill seeks to entrench three funds in the Constitution. So we have it intends to insert a new Article 204A. You're all aware that the current Article 204 basically talks about the equalization fund. It's currently an entrenched fund within the current constitution. And so the amendment bill seeks to insert, after the article on the equalization fund, the bill seeks to insert a new article that will now insert the National Government Constituencies Fund, which is basically the CDF. And then we have the other requirement is that it would like to insert a new Article 204B into the Constitution, which would entrench the Senate Oversight Fund. And it would there's also the third clause of the bill is to insert a new Article 204C, which is basically to entrench the National Government Affirmative Action Fund. So those are the main clauses of the bill. In terms of the statement of the objectives of each of these funds, because they're provided in the bill. For the CDF, it basically states that it's supposed to ensure reasonable access to exclusive national government functions in all constituencies as envisaged by Article 6, 3 of the Constitution, and also to ensure the participation of the people in the identification and implementation of priority national government programs. So that's the statement of the objective of entrenching the CDF into the Constitution. And then the stated objective for entrenching the Senate Oversight Fund is they claim that they would like to adequately empower the Senate to perform its oversight functions. So I think they imply that the Senate as it is currently not sufficiently empowered to perform its oversight functions, and we will discuss that. And then the objective of the third clause, which is to insert or entrench the Affirmative Action Fund, the stated objective here is that it's supposed to enhance the measures of the national government on affirmative action. In a nutshell, that is the bill. It does not attempt to provide any further detail, any further mechanisms, or in terms of the administrative details, even a broad framework of how is obviously conspicuously missing from this bill. So that is basically the statement of the objectives of this bill. We go to the next slide. And so having understood what the outlook of the bill is, we asked ourselves, what are some of the constitutional questions and some of the legal questions that arise surrounding these amendments? And to answer this, we flagged out a number of issues that actually violate basic constitutional principles. So I have mentioned here that Parliament or National Assembly has tried to sneakily avoid the question of the how in terms of the administration, but we know that the funds as they are, and if you refer back to the president's memorandum that actually triggered the drafting of this bill, there had been a president's memorandum, I think in 2022, where he was proposing for Parliament to consider making certain amendments to the Constitution. And these amendments were basically to ensure four things. The first was implementation of the 2/3 gender rule, and then there was entrenchment of the constituency development, Senate oversight, and affirmative action funds. Then the third was the position of the leader of official opposition, and then the fourth was talking about parliamentary oversight of the executive. So there was a proposal he had proposed that Parliament considers a mechanism to ensure constitutional amendments that would address those issues. So knowing that as part of the background, and also knowing how the CDF in particular has operated, the operations of and administration of CDF in Kenya, looking at the history, we know that part of the entrenching this fund, we know that the administration, even if they will say that it's not directly by members of the National Assembly, the patron, as they said, in the current fund is usually the member of the National Assembly, which it's basically another way of ensuring that implementation is overseen. Implementation of those funds is still overseen by members of the National Assembly, which raises a significant violation of the question of separation of powers, because as you are aware, the role of members of parliament or the roles of legislators are primarily three, that is legislation, oversight, and representation. And if you read Article 95, specifically on the National Assembly, there's also appropriation, obviously, of the national budget, so appropriation of funds for utilization by the national government. And then there is the division of the allocation of funds. So the determination of allocation of funds between the national government and county governments. So there's legislation, representation, oversight, in addition to the appropriation functions. Now, the question of separation of powers begins to blur this the role of the legislature, because implicitly there is a requirement for them to implement the same fund that they are supposed to be overseeing, and for which the appropriation, so there's conflict of interest, basically. Conflict of interest arises because they're supposed to ensure oversight for the same funds whose administration they oversee. These questions were discussed broadly in the Supreme Court's case on the NGCDF. I think you're all aware of the facts of that case and their ruling. And in essence, the CDF fund was deemed to be unconstitutional. They tried to sanitize it by making it or recalling it now a national government constituencies development fund. But at the heart of implementation or administration of that fund, it's still the same basic mechanisms, where we have constituencies, the fund being implemented at constituency level and being overseen by the members of parliament. Then on the question of the Senate Oversight Fund, so they've stated, as I mentioned earlier, that the objective is to empower the Senate and senators to be able to effect their functions more, to undertake their functions more effectively. So the problem here, or the question here that we see, is that it seems to monetize their constitutional oversight duty, which is already adequately provided for. They're supposed to, as a matter of fact and as a matter of the constitutional requirement, they're supposed to undertake their oversight duty based on the appropriation that are already provided to that institution, not through further monetizing that function and providing a separate fund to supposedly enable them to perform their function more effectively. And then the other thing that I've already mentioned is that these amendments avoid detailing the fund administration. We do not expect the Constitution to go into the very, very nitty-gritties of how a certain function is supposed to be executed, but we provide minimum basics for the people to be able to understand. Just first of all, as a question of transparency and accountability, and for the people to understand in advance how that fund will be operationalized. Now, the reason why we suspect that they are quiet on mentioning the fund administration is because obviously it would interfere with the roles of the legislators, as are stipulated in Articles 95 and 96. And we do know that any question or any amendment that interferes with the functions of a legislator would have to be passed through a referendum. And I think Parliament, in their wisdom or lack of it, are trying to sneak in the amendments without that to be able to avoid the question of a referendum. And that has posed significant questions. We go to the next slide. So understanding this provisions in another way, it's basically, we can categorize the violations in terms of, or understand these violations in terms of procedural flaws and substantive flaws. So the procedural flaws is part of what I've already mentioned, that the memorandum of objects failed to declare if these amendments affect the parliament, the memorandum fails to declare if these amendments affect Parliament's functions, and that would violate what we have in Article 255, Article 255(1). So Article 255(1) talks about the amendments, the procedure for amendments, and the amendments that must be subjected to a referendum for approval. And those are amendments that relate to either the supremacy of the Constitution, the territory of Kenya, the sovereignty of the people, national values and principles of governance, the Bill of Rights, the terms of office of the President, the independence of the judiciary, the functions of Parliament, which is what we are looking at today, and the objects, principles, and structure of devolved government, and the provisions of, basically the provisions of that chapter itself. That's the chapter on amending the constitution. So Parliament realizes that if, for instance, there would be any mention or any implied or nuance that the funds that they are proposing to entrench would actually be implemented by themselves, it would be a violation of the constitution, and it would be fundamentally touching on the question of their functions. That's the functions of parliament. And so as a result, that question would have to be approved through a referendum. And I think they're trying to avoid that. Also to note that there's the other question of an absence of a referendum law. So I think you all heard about that discussion during the previous BBI attempted amendments through the BBI. Parliament was required to enact, and it's a constitutional requirement, but the judiciary did remind Parliament that there's an urgent need to implement a referendum law that would detail how a referendum is supposed to be conducted in the instance that Parliament makes certain proposals for amendment of the constitution that would have to go through a referendum. So that shift between concluding the parliamentary process and going into the referendum process, we currently have a lacuna in the law in terms of how that is supposed to be done. But as you're all aware, Parliament has consistently failed to do that. So that's again another problem. So then the substantive contradictions, I have again referred to that previously. It violates Article 95 and 96 on the roles of the National Assembly and Senate. And then it also violates Article 201 on the public finance principles, which is basically in terms of transparency, accountability, as much as possible, entrenching a fund that has such great consequence to the allocation and utilization of already limited funds that we have. It should be as open as possible, and the people should be aware of what exactly and how exactly Parliament is proposing to implement such a provision if the amendment is passed. Then it also violates Article 10 on the national values. So I've already talked about that both this the nature of this constitution amendments are defective, both procedurally and in terms of substance. Then the next thing we go to, as I mentioned, and I'm coming towards now the end of this legal analysis. So these amendments are problematic from the legal side, and Leo will talk about the economic side. From the legal side, these amendments are defective because they are superfluous. To me, they are unnecessary. They are both unconstitutional, as I've demonstrated, and they're also unnecessary. And unnecessary because if you understand the objects or what they're trying to achieve, it's already currently adequately provided for in other parts of the Constitution itself. And then the other question, the unconstitutionality question, is already demonstrated because of the question of the Constitution is very clear in terms of the demarcation of powers between the three branches of government. So development, oversight, affirmative action are all achievable under our current existing laws and also the Constitution. So development, as we know, is a role of the national government through the ministries and agencies. Parliament is not supposed to be involving itself. And let me say, the National Assembly is not supposed to be concerning itself with development. So if there are significant questions of, as they are trying to reference the object of that amendment to Article 6 of the Constitution, where that talks about making sure that services are accessible to all parts of the territory. Note that Article 6 is actually titled Devolution and Access to Services, and basically Parliament is trying to interpret this article to their benefit, while the Constitution had structured it to particularly for devolution purposes, to ensure that both the national and county governments, the devolved structure of government should be able to perform its functions to ensure equitable access across all parts of the country. So that question of making sure services are accessible in all parts should be adequately covered by the functions of national government through implementation of development projects at both national and county government levels. And it is, if there are any gaps or failure, then that additional resource should be provided at either the national level of government, or the national government agencies and departments should have adequate resources to address the gap, or the county governments through their locations should be able to do that. There's nowhere where it says that constituencies where there are any additional gaps, then constituencies must implement development projects. So that's a problem. And then affirmative action oversight. Let me say first, affirmative action, again, is Article 27 of the Constitution provides adequately for the question of affirmative action. And again, if there are any gaps in terms of implementing or ensuring that affirmative action programs run effectively and efficiently, then the role of providing those resources and in an adequate manner is again with the Parliament. So the National Assembly could adequately provide for this without the need of entrenching a fund here through budgetary provisions, and Leo would provide more detail on this. The Parliament can provide for this. Then the other question of oversight, again, is already a function that is oversight for the Senate purposes, is already a function of Senate and Article 96, providing the resources required for senators to empower senators to perform their functions effectively is a role of Parliament through the appropriations. Whatever gap they are trying to close here, through the appropriations process, they can provide adequate funds to ensure that senators have the capacity to implement their function. So those amendments, as we say, are superfluous and unconstitutional for those reasons that the Constitution itself has already provided for the mechanisms to close for this. And we are trying to avoid the situation that we had under the previous Constitution, where just for convenience, our wide drafts of unnecessary amendments would be introduced to mutilate the Constitution. And then lastly, as I conclude, go to the last slide, Leo. My last slide. Yeah, I've mentioned, so the summary of the legal side of these amendments is they undermine constitutional integrity and separation of powers. They seem to be sanitizing previously unconstitutional practices. Courts already held that any form of implementing a fund that is supposed to be done by legislators is inherently unconstitutional. And then it's a clear indication of misuse of the Constitution Amendment power that is provided under Article 255. Notice that by the mere fact that the Constitution itself provided for or allowed for amendments, it does not mean that we are saying that the Constitution should never be amended. In fact, the reason why we have proposals for amendment is because the framers of the Constitution, and we are also aware that circumstances change, context changes, and so the Constitution provided for a leeway and for a mechanism. The problem here is for abuse of that process, for unnecessary amendments, and also violation of the process. So if Parliament was to do this constitutionally, our recommendations would be, one, either withdraw this bill, because first of all, I've mentioned the amendments are superfluous, or for the provisions that they would like to entrench, because they fundamentally touch on the questions that are on the issues that are entrenched in Article 255, they should be subjected to a referendum. Parliament needs to, first of all, enact a referendum law. They have failed to do that, but they should, as soon as possible, actually implement or draft a referendum law and then go through this process again, subject the questions that they are trying to entrench in the Constitution to a referendum. And then the other recommendation is for the gap that they're trying to address with strengthening legislative oversight, they need to do this without monetary inducements, do this through appropriations. Then the question of there's need to enhance public participation to safeguard the Constitution, because the Article 1 of the Constitution, obviously talks about the sovereignty of the people, the supremacy of the Constitution, the article that everyone actually can recite at heart. And what that means is that before any amendment of this nature can be done, it must be subjected to the people's approval. And so Parliament should do a better job to enhance public participation, basically to safeguard the Constitution. And then also, lastly, to strengthen executive institutions and regular budgetary oversight, and there's no need for parallel funds. So what we are saying is the nature of these amendments, our interpretation of the nature of these amendments is that they could be effectively addressed by strengthening executive institutions. If the CDF fund that is beloved at the constituency level, that, as they claim, because of providing bursaries and education and water development projects and whatever other projects, those are essentially core functions of the national government, ministries, departments, and agencies. And there's no need for providing parallel funds while you could just strengthen executive institutions and let the separation of powers work as created in the Constitution. Let the executive implement development projects. Let the legislature draft legislation and policy and ensure oversight, and let the judiciary interpret for us the laws and where there are violations. So that brings me to the end of my presentation, and now we'll go to the second part of this analysis, which is basically the economic analysis that is done by my colleague Leo.
In the general economy, we have what we call fiscal policy aggregates, and then we have monetary policy aggregates. On the fiscal policy side, under Chapter 12 of the Constitution, taxes, it covers taxes, it covers budgets, public spending, it covers waivers, it covers subsidies, it covers incentives. All the fiscal policy aggregates are covered under Chapter 12. Then there's an important element under Chapter 12, which is fiscal federalism. Chapter 11, but Chapter 12, the process of dividing resources. And and that's why the amendments, these amendments in adding funds is it's an economic question, which the Constitution has already covered and spoken for extensively. As you all know, taxes, the Constitution divided taxes between what could be collected by national government, and all the major taxes went to the national government. And then secondly, provided property and entertainment taxes and other taxes that could be authorized by an act of parliament to be collected by county governments. So the Constitution, there was a little bit more of economic reasoning on those resources. As Jackie has explained, what members of parliament at the Chepkonga and Otiende Amolo bill wants to achieve is to change the discourse around those questions settled under constitutional law and settled by a constitution. So there are two problems here. One problem is there's a problem of public service delivery. either roads, either education. So there is a component. So and the way members of parliament justify this is that this is popular in the grassroots, and because they're responding to bursaries, they're responding. So there's a problem on this public service side. However, the interpretation by members of parliament is that instead of them taking to task the State Department for Education, they're changing tact and saying and saying that part of it should involve them providing those funds at constituency level, irrespective of what the constitution has provided. So those two tensions are there. So first, on the fiscal policy side, there'll be an immediate economic challenge uh, if the amendment is adopted. The National Assembly and the Senate are holders of the past. They make decisions, key decisions on division of the national revenue between national and county governments. Now it introduces a third layer, which is now the three funds. In the previous parliament, in the previous parliament before the new constitution was promulgated, we had a Westminster model, which is members of parliament were members of the executive. So parliament and executive were intertwined at some point. And that was a problem because most decisions that parliamentarians were supposed to make, they made it at the behest of the executive because they were members of the executive. So to cure that problem of incentive incompatibility, the constitution took away those budget powers. Now the constitution provided that they should only allocate and oversight those agencies of government. But now, here, the clawback was that CDF continued to run as a legacy problem, as a legacy question to the new constitution, but there was no basis for it under the new constitution. And that's not just the CDF. There are many other things. Provincial administration eliminated by the new constitution, but those ones continue. So it's one of those elements. So, and under the CDF, members of National Assembly participated in project implementation. At first, they were directing those activities. Then when the law was challenged, they came up with a new law that put them as patrons, and they appointed new CDF managers. But institutionally, they continue to participate directly. Already, some members of parliament, as you've seen in the news and in previous meetings, in the previous declarations by the Director of Public Prosecution, members of parliament have been charged with benefiting from CDF. So, in essentially, that legacy problem, has now come to be a slush fund for members of parliament. And so the problem that we are seeing immediately is that the process of the division of revenue, because they'll be now required to provide under the division of revenue, under that process, what will be going to the three funds. And that will create tensions, given the fact that Kenya only has two levels of government: the national government and the county governments. The constitution already, the Supreme Court already noted that the CDF is almost like a third layer of fiscal federalism, which is a third layer of devolved power. So that tension will emerge. And remember, counties under the current dispensation are already at a disadvantaged position. And they're already at a disadvantaged position because they were not able to make, they are not the rightful share, 15% of audited accounts as of last year is not what the counties received. Because Parliament has kept delaying the audited accounts, that there is a 3-year lag, that counties continue to receive smaller and smaller shares, that if you turn up them, they are missing something like 200 billion shillings annually if they had the constitution had been followed to the letter. So imagine that scenario, that members of parliament would now have a stake, and they would be the ones allocating money to these three funds, to the three funds, as well as allocating, making a decision on what goes to the national government and also to the county governments. So counties would be, that resource tension would exacerbate, and this is something that the constitution had already settled. Now, another problem is that Chapter 12 of the Constitution and the entirety of the Constitution of Kenya 2010 were settled, brought certainty on public finances. And in general, actually, because by bringing certainty to fiscal policy, you're bringing certainty on the on the economy. Most drafters, when going through the constitution, part of the thing that you want to achieve outside a constitutional draft is to bring that certainty. So there is a scholar called Backhouse who studied the German basic constitution, but also the American constitution. That certainty is something that you bring through various principles. So when the constitution, for example, makes a question of deciding that two levels of government, deciding how revenue is shared, what types of taxes are collected by each level of government, that is certainty in fiscal federalism. And so they created that certainty, has been created. Now, if that amendment goes into place, there'll be an hybrid structure, which is national, county, and constituency funds, stroke another layer of county funds, because the women reps would also have a say, have that. Then the Constitution 2010, the bigger pillar is the division of the separations of powers. And separations of powers principle is just to make sure that for those checks and balances to occur, each side should not have an incentive not to, for example, make certain decisions so, but however, if you check the problem that this will create is that it will entrench those legislator managed funds and diffuse spending authority. Another question that is in the constitution, the structural question in the constitution is, the constitution created that horizontal equity by providing that allocations to counties be done on a basis. And that basis, they created a constitutional commission, the CRA, to provide that basis, and they're supposed to look into specific issues. And then on the other side, created what you call the vertical equity, which is now resource allocation based on functions and stroke responsibility, national versus county. Remember, the national government, county government, they are shared functions, but there are functions that are completely devolved. So like primary health care, for example. So there is no need for national government to run functions on rural hospitals, because that's a county function. Primary health care needs to take place in that. So those are two. The constitution settled the questions of vertical and horizontal equity. But however, if you now look at it the new layer would be new funds would bypass that equity-driven county transfers, and constitutional allocations would now not be aligned to needs or fiscal capacity, because mostly it's on that basis that the consensus is built around the number of constituencies. So it will be an economically inequitable resource flow. Then efficiency and budgetary fragmentation. Remember, members of parliament, the CDF was created when the CDF was created, and there was no 2010 constitution. But when the 2010 constitution came, part of the challenge that the CDF settled was the question of expressly providing for, like, for example, Article 53 provides for free and compulsory basic education for all children. That is a settled question in the Constitution. But now the members of parliament have not provided robust studies in, and especially how they allocate those resources to be able to meet that constitutional question. However, what we are seeing is that part of it is they keep running bursaries as part of CDF, and that is a duplication to already what the Constitution requires that State Department of Basic Education to do, and it minimizes duplication of efforts and bureaucratic and creates those bureaucratic layers. So after the amendment, parallel funds outside county system. Remember, some of those things that they'll be responding to questions of education, responding to questions of roads. Some of them would be designated as county roads, responding to questions of police stations. That's a national government function. So it's not a public service reform, but rather another form of creating resource flows for a different channel. And those are good things that the Constitution already settled for. And then it reduces that allocative and technical efficiency of public spending. Because if it is about the quality of classrooms across the Republic, the ministry should be able to provide a roadmap on how those providing those quality and classrooms across the Republic, and ensuring that not only areas that around city centers that have classrooms, but also rural schools it should not be under a tree. Those are the things, and it's a function of MPs to make sure that that happens. And if that does not happen, they use powers bestowed to them by the Constitution to take action. Then another problem is budget. So budget items, soft budget constraints. I'll discuss that in detail. Members of parliament would be, under the current dispensation, are responsible for actually direct CDF, even though under the law they claim that they don't direct. Part of the problem that you see from that is when they appear before parliament, the same parliament, the same CDF manager from that constituency appearing before those committees to answer questions related to the use of public funds. So they will be shielded from fiscal scrutiny. Even if the Auditor General makes a determination, that will not be a problem. On the national government side, National Treasury now is required under law that after the sector hearings, be able to consolidate the budget and be able to make a budget that responds to the needs of the people as required by the Constitution. But that will also weaken Treasury's capacity because those resources would go away. Now, it undermines devolution. It changes the roles of senators. it creates higher transaction costs. But the the bigger problem is on the question of separation of powers. You see, the principal agency theory in the Constitution is that the people hold the power. The power is delegated to members of parliament and people in the executive branch who get elected. And those now, the executive branch will execute, and the other arms will also provide services like the judiciary and others. And then the members of parliament will ensure that the executive would provide those services in a lawful manner, but also the most efficient manner. And that's why they require that those finances be managed transparently, accountably, and equitably. Parliament controls appropriation, the executive implements, and then the oversight by independent officers. And when they make determinations, those independent officers make determination. Parliament is supposed to ensure that those determinations are executed to the letter. So, for example, if somebody wastes or misuses resources, Parliament is now expected to take action against and ensure that those charges happens, or people are recommend to the EACC and for them to be investigated and prosecuted. Now, that separation ensures that no institution dominates the budget cycle. That if Parliament makes a mistake, the judicial branch will provide judicial oversight. That budget discipline and fiscal transparency, is so. But the problem with this now is that it hybrids, it makes the entire process that principal agency theory in the Constitution disappears, because the people's representatives will now not be able to provide those checks and balances because of those specific funds. Jackie has already explained the question of the conflict of interest, but in an economic, the economic argument here is that, so for example, so in an economy, we have what we call the business cycle. We have what we call the busts and the booms. The boom is you are doing 10 to 8%, 10 to 8%. So there are surpluses. The revenues are okay. And then Parliament cannot authorize bigger budgets. But when in a bust, for example, like during the COVID period, when people sheltered in place and the economy contracted, Parliament must essentially authorize a smaller budget. That is an adjustment. And if you read, and I'll explain shortly, Article 220 of the Constitution, there's a basis and there's a recognition for that. That's why you see Parliament doing the budget review and Treasury doing and submitting to Parliament budget review outlook paper, which now looks at the performance of the economy against budget for performance, the budget policy statement, stating priorities and making the ceilings. In the budget policy statement, one of the key things is providing for the ceilings. What will be the ceilings in that specific year? That is fiscal discipline, providing that fiscal discipline in a process that is mediated through public participation. However, if you are looking in, saying, for example, that 2.5% of the budget will go specifically to CDF, that is a commitment that you will not be able to reverse and be able to provide fiscal discipline, whether you are in a business cycle, whether you are in a bust or a boom. That's the reason why that separation of powers was made evident in the Constitution. And this is from the economic problems that Kenya went through in the 1990s. You all remember what happened. So if you look at the the national government CDF as it is today, there's an earmark, the fixed minimum allocation of 2.5% of national government share of revenue yearly, regardless of fiscal outlook. And then if you read the Constitution, Article 220, Parliament, national government is required not to spend funds other in a way that in a way other than authorized in an appropriation act, and that appropriation act shall be made and no appropriation shall be made unless it is included in estimates presented to Parliament. That's the essence of giving Parliament a bigger say. Why? The Constitution recognized that Parliament will only play that role, and on the other side, the executive will not be party to such decisions, so that you create incentives for each parties to stay different in different places. Article 220 of the Constitution is central for fiscal discipline, and that it justifies that all expenditures need to be made through detailed estimates, Parliament to scrutinize and approve spending every year. Additionally, that budgeting to reflect macroeconomic conditions and realistic revenue expectations. The problem with NGCDF is this. To now, the constitutional argument against NGCDF is this. It mandated that fixed an earmark. We call it in budget terms, an earmark is that fixed allocation, irrespective of what happens. A fixed allocation of 2.5% of 2.5%. That made it a statutory entitlement, and it's not a discretionary expenditure. But now, and this, despite the fact that it's drawing money from this consolidated fund. The problem is that commits fiscal space. So if Kenya, for example, was to go through like COVID is a very good example because it was a crisis, and that they are not able to meet all this revenue, and Parliament, for example, could be required to change the budget to be able to accommodate a crisis like public health crisis, direct all those resources to public health crisis. It won't, because this is already it's already fixed in the Constitution. So the problems with earmarks, and earmarks are not good features of budgets, is that it fixes the fiscal space and it crowds out that fiscal space. And fiscal space is supposed to be, the budget is supposed to be made realistic to participation, to conditions, to macroeconomic environment, to the needs, to the crisis. Even a crisis could be ongoing or something that needs to be done urgently. It's not to fix the arm of Parliament to make sure that they cannot allocate outside that. Then Article 220 also requires that the process of zero budgeting, based budgeting, which that each program must earn a place in the budget every year. Every year, you must justify why, for example, we need to pay specific items in the budget. And that's why they go to sectors. And sectors, it's not just government officials alone. There are also other stakeholders. And their arguments are made for and against the others. By the time the budget comes to the National Treasury consolidated and the entire thing, the process is supposed to be that each idea is not each must earn its place in the budget every year. But now, once you embed that in the law, it means it will be given. It will be statutory. It will not be a contest. It will not be, for example, some MPs to justify why they need to to build a police station and not a school, or a school. So you see that kind of an argument, the way then the NCDF again becomes immune to scrutiny and cuts, or cuts to form of fiscal entrenchment. Remember, Kenya has gone through a cycle of budget or fiscal consolidation, which is austerity measures. No day have we ever had CDF being a debate that there was a reduction. You've had former Chief Justice, for example, Maraga. You've had the current Chief Justice and complain about those budget cuts to the judiciary. Then, so once you embed that and make it statutory, it will be difficult for each and every budget item to be a subject of a public debate as required under the Constitution. Then again, to reduce deficit under fiscal consolidation, Treasury must could make suggestions to cut or freeze expenditures. But once CDF becomes entrenched, that becomes untouchable. Now, the unintended effects. So let me give a simple hypothesis. And I want to illustrate using this chart. Remember that when government of Kenya, because it's 2.5% of the national budget, MPs are more inclined to approve bigger budgets because the share of CDF increases. It increases. And that's why between 2009 and 2021, Kenya was on a fiscal expansion, largely because of amongst other things, but because MPs could not enforce fiscal discipline as required under Article 220 of the Constitution and Article 201 on the principles of public finance. They could not enforce that fiscal discipline largely because of the bigger budgets. Bigger budgets was game on for national MPs, for members of the National Assembly. And that's why, if you look at the net lending as a share of borrowing as a share of GDP, borrowing went up. Borrowing went up all the way until 2020, and when the IMF program started, you now see, you see in the chart, that now net lending starts to go to reduce. I want people to understand this. The function of giving MPs powers of the past, and that's why in other places, including the US Congress, the executive makes suggestions, proposals to Congress, and then the Congress approves them. But there is no hybrid format in between. And this is a very good measure, because the problem with that is that 2.5% floor pushed MPs to ensure that they have bigger budgets so that share would go up, irrespective of whether actual revenues collected, competing national priorities, economic crisis, and others. We have the IEA as a study that was published that did try to look at the model that National Treasury and Parliament was using to make decisions. And we noticed substantial errors between GDP, estimation of GDP, and estimation of revenues. And part of the challenge, the political economy reason that we took from that is that now the executive the executive favored big budgets, favor big those areas were to favor a bigger borrowing to justify a bigger borrowing because larger borrowings, and that's why MPs approved higher deficits. So, as I conclude, the Article 2, the main message is to preserve the integrity of the Constitution. If the foundational problem is that, and we all agree that public services are a problem, they're either too expensive, whether school fees expensive, whether subsidies are required, whether there's a problem with public service reform, with public provision of public services, the solution should be how can the State Department of Basic Education be forced to take cognizance of those problems. But it should not be addressed through another problem by creating another fund to address those problems. And that's the Kenyan problem, the original sin, which is addressing, once there's a problem, you come up with a fund to address that specific problem. So the integrity of the Constitution is that the separation of powers principle, if you look at Article 203 on the horizontal and vertical equity issues, on how resources should be shared, the basis for sharing national revenue. These amendments are not it's not just adding a fund. It's amending structurally other provisions of the Constitution. So the preserving the integrity of the Constitution is a big question. The second part is, in the IEA, we have something we call public goods. And then we have what we call constitutional obligations. The Constitution has provided certain obligations under Article 43, economic and social rights, under Article 53, providing services to children. Kenya is a child-rich society because 78% of Kenya's population are below the age of 35 and below. So fiscal policy and management of resources should be to address these problems. And the better way is to now discuss public sector reform. And that public sector, instead of amending the Constitution, and because that mechanism will not work. Thank you so much.
Brings us to the end of our presentation. So we've tried to, as best as we could, to unpack the substance of this amendment bill from the legal perspective and from the economic perspective. And because I think we are well above our time in terms of the presentations, I'd like to invite you now to participate in a plenary discussion. So if anyone has a question, if you have your own views and thoughts around the amendments, just comments, we're very glad to hear them. So please raise your hand and I'll allow you to ask your question or to make your comment. If there's something you'd like a clarification on, yes, this is your opportunity. So yes. I'd like to open this up to plenary now to hear what thoughts you might have. If there's something you fundamentally disagree with and you think that the entrenchment of this constitution is the way forward, should be the way forward, maybe we can also hear your arguments. Yes. Anyone, please raise your hand. And thanks, Ronald. I see your comment. I'm waiting on the chat box. I don't see any questions. So let me see if anyone would like to ask a question. I see some of our partners here who are also actually participating in a process led by the Katiba Institute. Okay, before I go to that, I see a hand up, but I see some of our partners here who are also participating in a process to challenge this amendment bill. So if you're brave enough, I'd like to hear your views. But before that, I see Conrad Bosiria's hand is up. So Conrad, welcome. Your hand is up. Please unmute yourself and let's hear you. Conrad, are you muted? You're muted. Please unmute yourself and...
Oh, sorry, yes. I was just looking for the unmute button. Thank you.
Okay, okay.
Thank you. So thank you, Leo and Jacqueline, for that very informative presentation. And of course, the issues which you've spoken to are very timely in terms of what is going on in Parliament, and also in the face of the facts that the courts, all the way to the Supreme Court, have pronounced themselves on these issues. There's something which, when it comes to these discussions that I've been battling with, of course, the constitutional and legal framework is very clear on the place of these three funds, and what the parliament is trying to do is actually going against what is an established framework of governance in the country. That is very clear. My question is whether you've looked at the history of CDF and the role that it played. There were studies that showed its positive contribution. And I'm not saying this in order to bend the current legal framework. And also because of the unrelenting political pursuit to maintain these funds and even entrench them in the constitution. But I'm just asking, for instance, we have conditional grants from the national government. One of the middle points, and this is not a point I'm firmly on, but because of the ongoing debates, is whether these funds can actually be administered as conditional grants. And of course, their nature and characterization in the financial architecture to be removed from what they are currently under the legislature. Then we have conditional grants with conditions including that when they are spent essentially by county governments, the input of MPs has to be given priorities and all that. And this is because MPs have for the longest time played a role in local development, and it's somehow attached to their credentials for re-election. And it's a culture which it seems we are struggling to undo. So I'm not firmly on those issues, but it's an issue for debate and to hear what your reflections are, if at all you looked at those sides. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. That's very useful. Let's see if anyone else has a question before so that you can respond to a few questions at once. Does anyone else have a question or comment that you'd like to add to that? Okay. So before, as you prepare your other questions, Conrad, I hear you. And yes, indeed, we are very much privy to the studies that have been undertaken to document the significance of the CDF in some areas, the use, or the utilization. We've also seen in some of the public participation exercises, people talking about particularly the bursaries, that they provide a lifeline to many students, and they have been very useful. So we do not argue with that fact. That's notwithstanding, the only question, the issue here we're talking about, and of course you agree, is fidelity to the Constitution. So the Constitution pronounces itself in certain regards and makes certain separations, obviously because of the conflict of interest and matters. The CDF has supposedly done the things that it's celebrated for. On the other hand, we know, or we are all aware of the fraud and sort of corruption breaches in terms of MPs actually directly benefiting from the CDF itself. And regardless of how the benefits that are drawn or derived from the CDF, the thing that you are saying is, if we feel that now, because 15 years after the Constitution, we have decided as Kenyans that the CDF must be implemented in the structure that it is and that it's useful in the way that it is, then it should be subjected to, that change must be made through the proper constitutional mechanism, the mechanism provided in Article 255. And because it would significantly alter the functions of Parliament, then Kenyans must actually give their affirmation that we are making a decision to change this and to allow legislators to go this way. Of course, I think you are obviously aware and agree that there are fundamental flaws with that because of the question of separation of powers. But what we are saying is, because the Constitution has provided for the mechanism, then the fidelity to the Constitution demands that we must follow that mechanism before we allow a fund such as this to be implemented in the way it has been in the past without changing the Constitution. Because doing anything otherwise would be for us to say that we will allow unconstitutional mechanisms, or we will allow unconstitutional procedures simply because say certain segments of the population have made suggestions or have shown that they are beneficial. So on one hand, allowing an unconstitutional provision, but saying that the end justifies the unconstitutional means. So that is inherently problematic. But because the Constitution itself allows us to revise that, and to regularize that, then it should follow the right procedure through a referendum, if that was to be done. So we have seen the studies, but the problem is the question of just the underlying constitutional violations that we've talked about. On your other suggestion with regards to conditional grants, I think that it's something that it makes sense to me. It sounds like it would make sense, but again, now the last bit of your submission on it having specific input from MPs, the administration of those funds having specific input from MPs, obviously for being aware of their understanding of the constituencies, it's very valid, but the appropriations process already covers that. Remember, members of Parliament are the only ones who currently hold that power of the purse, as Leo has explained. Under Article 95, the question of appropriations, they can cover for that currently as it is, using the mechanisms that are provided in the Constitution, if they so wished. And obviously aware of the challenges that are there, development challenges that are there at each constituency, they have that mechanism to do it through the appropriations process. The need to do it further through the conditional grants can be done. I suspect it would not be a gross violation as we currently have in the current amendment bill, but it might also just be superfluous because we already have that mechanism provided in the law. The question of the equalization fund, the objects that are currently listed as being a requirement for the CDF, actually word for word, almost match the requirements and for what the equalization fund should be doing. So why is it that they are not using the mechanisms that are already there in the Constitution? What is this additional benefit that they draw from the CDF? So that would be my response. But the conditional grants one, I think, can be explored and maybe tightened and thought about more seriously. But yeah, we must be aware of those challenges. Leo, I'd like to invite you to add to that.
Yes. So first, remember that when it comes to first, CDF is very popular. Secondly, CDF, all these three funds have bipartisan support in both houses of government. In fact, I think even in the current environment, political environment, that is the only thing that I think all MPs agree on, and all political factions agree on. However, if you look at even the most popular thing that the CDF provides for, which is bursaries, the Constitution requires under Article 53 to provide free and compulsory basic education for all children. Members of Parliament are not willing to have a discussion on how that can be funded on a priority basis and appropriately. You've all seen the strikes that are ongoing across the country because capitation has delayed and children are sick. But again, it's not just children are angry. Sorry, children are hungry. But again, especially during the cold season. But again, it's not just bursaries. It's with the roads. If you look at the Kenya Road Sport Act and you look at the function, how are resources raised under from RMLF and other mechanisms, including securitization, you look at the constituency development, the roads committee under one, I think should be section 9, one of those sections. A member of parliament sits in those committees. Members of parliament are now sitting in organs of the executive branch to make decisions on roads policy. So what I'm saying is this, that the challenge with this is it's an hybrid executive and legislature. It's not just a question of service public sector reform, but it's just a question of MPs making now decisions and sitting in areas, especially areas where they think the resources are enough and are many are more, and they could benefit. And now I can say something. I want to say something for the record, and this is on the answer of the Senate. The senator for Kakamega once said that if you look at the parking spaces for the other house and the house where he sits in, there's a difference in those parking spots. He was making an argument that part of the problem is that the other house has a slush fund and this one doesn't have a slush fund. So there's a constitutional argument, and then there are other advanced arguments why this like whether if members of parliament would be able to ensure fiscal discipline once this provision has been passed into the constitution. And fiscal discipline is not just important for the debt crisis which Kenya is in now. It's important for other things like interest rates. It's important for, and it has like it's not just because once budget grow up quickly, there's an effect from the economy on other individual aggregates, and that affects both the quality of life and of the ordinary Kenyan, and sector specific issues in detail that we could provide. So to your question, Dr. Bosire, it's popular. Is it making public sector, especially like provision of those services, whether it's education or roads, effective? I don't think so. I don't think so, because it's a smaller percentage. If we are to do benefit incidence of those resources, vis-a-vis if Parliament, for example, has decided to look at the entire basic education sector and make a deliberative decision from the budget and say we are adding another 100 billion shillings until the cost of providing for a student has fallen significantly to this amount. If you look at the trade-off analysis, it's not cost effective. But does it provide a lifeline to Kenyans, as Jackie has said? Yes, and most Kenyans agree with that. Thank you so much. So on that, I don't think. On the equalization fund, even the fund itself, if you look at the report of the Auditor General, and if you look at what is National Treasury needs to pay, it's only one of those constitutional funds that there's a lot of balances. If you look in the summary for the national government, you'll see that table. There are a lot of balances. On the conditional grants, the effectiveness of National Treasury has used this to advance national government objectives. You've all seen the way that was used for medical leasing. You've also seen the way, so it's not a decision. So it's not there's a way those resources were now, because it's in the ambit of the decision is in the ambit of the Treasury. Those decisions were made in a way that disadvantages specific counties. You are given equipment, for example, that you don't need, and those processes were not done in the deliberative effort. Remember that. And okay, I could speak more and more on that subject, but let me leave at that so that people can ask questions.
All right. Thanks, Leo. So we hope we've answered your question, Conrad. So let's see if anyone else has a question. Any further thoughts, comments, questions, additions, clarification? Conrad, your hand goes up again, please. Yeah, you
I'm
can
sorry
unmute yourself.
if
It's
there's
okay.
anyone else I can yield, but I just wanted one more question. Sorry.
Yeah.
In your studies, did you look at similar funds in multi-level systems of government around the world, how they have approached that, especially if it interacts with that separation of powers, vertical and horizontal, between the levels of government and arms of government? Is there anything to learn from there?
Okay. We've noted that question. Leo, you'd like to respond?
Oh, okay. Yes. So if you look, what happens in other countries, in other parts of the world, especially looking at the most similar constitution to ours in terms of all respects of to presidential system, is both South Africa and the US, especially the US. Once Congress do not run or direct or make key decisions on a day-to-day basis in the executive branch. They just make, so what we've noticed is, and for them they use the reconciliation method, so that the only thing that they want to follow is the outcomes, whether those outcomes were satisfied, and they could sanction from time to time. And for them, and I think, and then there's an hands-off approach. The members do not sit in committees, for example, that make decisions on roads, but rather they sit on the other in parliament where there are specific. So let me use one example. There's the Inflation Reduction Act, which was a fiscal bill that brought up spending in specific areas. So one of them was to conserve environment, what we call regenerative agriculture. So what they made, the Congress made a decision to conserve wetlands, and they put in money and send it to the states, and they send it back to the states, but they don't participate in that the management day to day. And as Jackie said something fundamental, and I really hope that if we all forget anything, we should remember that, which is they've established the funds as they are in the Constitution. They want to establish the funds, the object of the funds as they are in the Constitution, but they are silent on management, on all the other specific details that would be required, just like the way we know what happens to consolidated fund. And what we suspect is part of this is the current law as it is will just replace and it will continue the way it is. So in other places, legislators make decisions on funds, but they task specific agencies within government to continue implementing that. And even when even as and that's the case for Kenya. All schools, for example, under the county director of education. Even with the way national government dispenses funds, makes administration questions, it's through the county, and those counties, those constituencies are in those specific counties. And that's similar to Kera, Kena, and Kura. All of them make specific decisions, but through the 10 regions and through the specific specific counties and specific constituencies. So I think if members of parliament wants to see specific outcomes, like on education, it should be directly without interfering, as from the example from the US example of what I've given on the Inflation Reduction Act, and that's similar to other places. So that hands-off approach, because the problem is what we are seeing is that hybrid, the both executive and legislature would now become an hybrid, a mixed match of the two.
Great. Thanks, Leo. We are coming to the end of this. I do not want to deny anyone a chance from asking a question before we give our closing remarks. So if there's anyone here who still has a question or who'd like to add to the discussion, this is your final chance. Please raise your hand and we will allow you to contribute to the discussion. Anyone with a question, a comment, additions? Okay. Because I do not see any hands and I do not see any questions on the chat box, I think we'll conclude now because we're actually 15 minutes over time. And so I'll ask Leo, please give your concluding remarks and then I'll wrap it up.
Thank you so much for attending this series. We intend to explore similar matters using the law and economy approach. And I've seen and in conclusion, the bigger question is that we understand that the society favors CDF. We also understand the fact that society wants to see that this bill has bipartisan support. But we are also cognizant of the fact that there are unintended consequences, both to the constitutional dispensation, but also to the performance in the general economy. So, and that is an important deliberation and point that we think, even as they move to deliberate on this, should be had. And finally, we should ask ourselves if the Ministry of Education is supposed, for example, to provide education that is accessible, affordable, and equitable, and that allows all Kenyans from all walks of life, irrespective of economic of income levels, to be able to attend education. Why is it not happening? And why does it require Kenyans to institute CDF to be able to meet that obligation? So that's a very important question that I think, and that is not a constitutional question, that's a question that on public economies that needs to be had. So we have to have the correct kind of framing to be able to address this problem. But as it is, summatively from me, for me, the CDF and the three other funds will be an entrenchment of the legacy problems that Chapter 12 of the Constitution wanted to eliminate. And it will be a derogation of the Constitution. So just to answer the final question. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks, Leo. And so as I conclude, I'll also just reiterate what we have said throughout this presentation. And obviously acknowledge that the popularity of, for instance, the CDF, but unfortunately that popularity does not override. It does not override the Constitution. And what we are saying here is that if the goals of these funds are so popular, then they should be implemented through laws, through current or new policies and legislation. Sorry, excuse me. They should be implemented through legislation, but not entrenched through unconstitutional means. If we open up a mechanism and allow an unconstitutional process, simply because, say, a fund is popular, we'll just be opening up a floodgate of violations. And we must learn from our history, because that's what our history tells us. And that's why the Constitution as is currently structured as it is. So if the goals of the CDF, they can be preserved, but let them not be implemented by MPs. In fact, allowing the new functions of these funds to be implemented by members of parliament, in my view, just creates an adverse incentive for members of parliament not to actually support the institutions that should be performing these functions. And that's the question of the public sector reforms that Leo was talking about. So it provides them with an adverse incentive, actually not to ensure that those institutions are performing as effectively as they should. So until we agree as Kenyans, and we can only show that we agree through a referendum, because these provisions are entrenched and must be passed through a referendum, then we should, for all intents and purposes, fight to ensure that we maintain the integrity of the Constitution. And so that is the summary of our presentation. We hope that this discussion here has been useful. And as somebody asked previously, yes, we will avail the presentation. This will be available immediately on the IEA's website. We usually place this, as well as all our other webinar presentations, on the website. And if you'd also like to later go back and refer to something we said, we also the IEA also has a YouTube channel where these webinars are usually uploaded. So thank you very much on behalf of Leo and myself and IEA for attending this discussion and for your contribution. Look out for other webinars. I believe we have another session. Another of IEA's programs has a webinar tomorrow. So if you're available or interested in that topic, the topic of their discussion, please attend the meeting tomorrow. You can find the information and the links on IEA's social media platforms, and specifically the Twitter platform. For those of you who are not members of IEA, the IEA is a membership institution, and we are open to new members. So you can reach out to our communications team, and they'll be available to assist you on how to become a member. So other than that, thank you everyone once again, and we wish you a good afternoon. And thanks, Leo, for making this presentation with me.